Welcome to Death Row Cases. Today we begin a new case. Right now, in the Florida State Prison, there's a man of 80 who knows the exact date he's scheduled to die. Not vaguely, somewhere in the future. A date, a time, a room. And if it happens, he will become the oldest person ever executed in the modern history of Florida. Not by a few months, by years. His name is Dominick Occhicone. He has been on death row since 1987, nearly 40 years, for the murder of the parents of his ex-girlfriend. Because of the length and the complexity of this case, we're splitting it into two parts. Today, the people, the night of the murders, the arrest, the trial, and the sentence. Coming this Thursday, the decades of legal battles that followed, and the tense weeks we find ourselves in right now, with an execution date closing in fast. And a quick word about how we research these cases for anyone listening for the first time. For every episode, we use public court documents, rulings from higher courts, published news reporting, and where possible, statements from advocacy organizations that work on these cases, both supporters and opponents of the death penalty. We take no position on guilt or innocence that hasn't been established by a court, and we try to represent, as honestly as we can, what is and isn't known with certainty. Let's go back to 1986. Pasco County lies north of Tampa, on the Gulf Coast of Florida. It's not a tourist magnet. It's a region of suburban neighborhoods, canals, and bungalows, the kind of place people move to for a quieter life than the big cities offer. Holiday, the town where this case unfolds, is exactly that kind of neighborhood, unremarkable, the kind of place where neighbors know one another, and where a shooting in the middle of the night wakes up everyone on the street. In a house in Holiday lived Anita Garrity, together with her children and her parents, Raymond and Martha Artzner. Anita had been in a relationship with a man named Dominick Occhicone. To understand what happened that night, it helps to know a little more about him first, because this is not a story about strangers meeting by chance. It's a story about people who already knew each other well, and a relationship that had gone wrong. Dominick Occhicone was born in 1945. From the later court records and witness testimony, a picture emerges of a man whose life had already taken its share of blows before this case began. His first wife had died of cancer. He was left a widower with the care of a young child, whom, by his own account, he was raising largely on his own. Then came the relationship with Anita Garrity, and that relationship was, in the words of several witnesses, one of highs and lows. There was something else at play too, something the mental health experts who later examined him described as a source of deep emotional distress. During the relationship, Anita had become pregnant and had decided to end that pregnancy. That decision and the breakup that followed are named in the court records as the source of an emotional turmoil that kept building in the months before the murders. It's a detail worth sitting with for a moment, not to excuse what came later, but because it shows how rarely these cases are black and white. On the one hand, a man who was a widower, raising a child alone, who fell apart emotionally after a breakup and an ended pregnancy. On the other hand, as we'll see, a man who in that same period told several people he intended to murder two innocent human beings. Both of those things are true at the same time. And it's precisely that duality a jury and a judge in a death penalty case have to work their way through. In the months and weeks before the murders, Occhicone was drinking heavily. A recurring place in this case is Shooter's Bar, a bar he visited regularly and where several bartenders knew him well. According to testimony that would later play a role in the trial, he was a heavy drinker there. And in the period after the breakup, he was also using cocaine. And now we come to the detail that would, legally speaking, ultimately decide this case. According to several witnesses, in the weeks before the murders, Occhicone spoke openly about his hatred for Anita's parents. A bartender named Lily Lawson would later testify that about 2 weeks before the murders, he had told her he felt like killing Anita's parents and making her watch. Another bartender, Cheryl Hoffman, testified that on at least 2 occasions he had told her he wanted to kill Anita's parents. A man named William Anderson would also testify about threatening statements. Let that sink in. Weeks in advance, to several people who had nothing to do with one another, he announced what he was planning to do. Not in a single flash of drunken bravado that passed once, but repeatedly and concretely, kill the parents while their daughter watched. This testimony would later form the backbone of the prosecution's case and at the same time become one of the biggest obstacles for the defense. There's another detail from the days just before the murders that paints a picture of how unmoored Occhicone was in that period. 2 days before the murders, on June 8th, he crashed his car into a tree right outside the home of a woman named Patricia Goddard. Witnesses who saw him then testified that he smelled of alcohol, was unsteady on his feet, and was visibly distraught over Anita. One of them saw that he had a firearm with him. That's the picture leading up to June 10th. A man who was drinking heavily, using cocaine, falling apart emotionally, carrying a weapon, and who had told several people he wanted to kill 2 human beings. Then the night itself. In the early morning hours of June 10th, 1986, Occhicone knocked on the sliding glass door of Anita's bedroom. It was the middle of the night. She woke to the knocking, refused to speak with him, and threatened to call the police. He left. An hour later, he came back, this time armed with a firearm. And here's something to take in carefully. He cut the telephone lines to the house. That is not an impulsive act. That is a calculated step, something you only do if you've thought in advance about what you're going to do, and wanted to make sure no one could call for help while it happened. In an era before cell phones, cutting the landline meant the people in that house were severed from the outside world. This very detail would come back again and again in the courtroom as one of the strongest indications that this was premeditation and not a drunken impulse. After cutting the telephone lines, he woke the entire household by shouting and pounding on windows and doors. Anita's father, Raymond Artzner, came outside. According to the court records, he had a broomstick with him and ordered Occhicone to leave. Occhicone shot him in the chest. While this was happening, Anita and her daughter fled the house to the neighbors, looking for help. Occhicone then broke into the house through a locked door. Once inside, he shot Martha Artzner, Anita's mother, 4 times, killing her. 4 times. Not a single shot in the heat of a struggle, but 4 separate shots at a woman who, as far as the records show, had no part in the relationship between her daughter and Occhicone. One of the judges would later describe the murder of Martha as an execution, the repeated, close-range shooting of an unarmed grandmother without any provocation on her part, as the fulfillment of the threats he had made weeks before. A responding deputy from the Pasco County Sheriff's Office found Raymond Artzner still alive. Before he died of his injuries, he reportedly stated that Dom had shot him. Take that detail in too. A dying man who, with his final words, names the man who shot him, the nickname of his own would-be son-in-law. That statement from the victim himself would later form an important piece of evidence in the trial. Occhicone fled the scene. He didn't get far. A police dog tracked his scent to nearby railroad tracks within hours, where deputies located and arrested him. It's a reminder of how much the outcome of a case like this can hinge on something as unglamorous as a trained dog and a stretch of railroad track, rather than any grand design in the justice system. Before we move on to the trial, this is the moment to look at Occhicone's criminal history, something we try to research as fully as possible in every case in this series, because it often weighs directly on the sentence. According to the court records, Occhicone had 1 prior conviction earlier in his life, for resisting arrest with violence against a police officer. In Florida, that's a 3rd-degree felony of violence. From the public sources available for this episode, this appears to have been his only prior conviction. We found no indication of outstanding charges in other states, no warrants elsewhere, and no other crimes he was wanted for at the time of the murders. His record, as far as is known, consisted of that single prior conviction, plus, of course, the 2 murders he was now to stand trial for. That may seem like a small detail, but it would come to play an important legal role. In American death penalty cases, a prior conviction for a violent felony counts as a separate aggravating factor when determining the sentence, apart from the murder someone is on trial for. We'll come back to this because this one old conviction would remain a subject of legal battle well into the 21st century. The trial of Dominick Occhicone took place in Pasco County. The defense built its case around one central argument: voluntary intoxication. That's the argument that a defendant was so under the influence of alcohol or drugs at the moment of the crime that he was incapable of forming the intent required for premeditated murder. It's important to draw a distinction here that's often confused. This is not a plea of insanity where someone claims not to have understood the act. It's a much narrower argument that the specific state of mind required for the most serious form of murder, premeditation, simply wasn't present because of the intoxication. If that argument succeeds, it doesn't mean someone goes free, but it does mean a conviction for premeditated murder, and with it the death penalty can be taken off the table. And at first glance, Occhicone's defense had material to work with. He was, and this wasn't in dispute, a heavy drinker. On the day and night before the murders, he had been drinking for hours, according to testimony that only fully came to light years later. A bartender would testify that she'd seen him drink about 10 shots of schnapps that morning, plus a vodka. Later that evening, she saw him again, drinking again, and just before 11, she saw him leave the bar with a bottle of vodka. But a defense based on intoxication has a fundamental problem. If you can show that someone acted in a deliberate, controlled way that night, the whole argument collapses. And that's exactly what the prosecution did. Cutting the telephone lines, bringing a weapon, the fact that he first left when Anita refused and only came back an hour later. The sequence and the deliberateness of those actions are hard to reconcile with someone too drunk to think. On top of that, several witnesses who had seen Occhicone 2 to 4 hours after the murders testified. He did not seem drunk to them at all. That detail became all the more important because Occhicone himself had claimed he lived in a near constant state of intoxication. And then there were those threats from weeks before. It's simply hard to maintain that someone couldn't think about what he was doing in the moment, when that same person had, weeks earlier, told several people exactly what he was going to do. There was another detail from the investigation that played a role, and that at first glance seems like a small thing. After his arrest, Occhicone refused to have his hands tested for gunshot residue, a so-called atomic absorption test. According to a deputy who testified about it, Occhicone said at that moment, "You're going to have to force me." His attorneys later argued the prosecution should not be allowed to use that refusal against him, because it would violate his right to remain silent. The court disagreed. The right to remain silent, according to the case law, protects only testimonial verbal communication, not the refusal of a physical test like a hand swab, just as someone can also be compelled to give fingerprints or a blood test. And because the police had never told him he could refuse that test, there was no misleading assurance later used against him. So the prosecution was allowed to point to that refusal as an indication of consciousness of guilt. These kinds of disputes about what does and doesn't fall under the right to silence come up more often in American criminal cases than you might think. They show how meticulously judges have to work out exactly where the line lies between a constitutionally protected right and a simple physical act someone can be compelled to perform. The jury found Occhicone guilty of 2 counts of premeditated first-degree murder. The intoxication defense had not carried the day. Then began the penalty phase, where the jury had to recommend whether the death penalty, life imprisonment, or some other sentence was appropriate. The jury recommended the death penalty by a vote of 7 to 5. Take that number in, 7 to 5. That's a non-unanimous recommendation, one of the closest possible splits. Almost half the jury, 5 of the 12 people, felt the death penalty was not the right outcome here. This kind of divided verdict is unusual within the United States. In most American states with the death penalty, a unanimous jury recommendation is required before a judge can impose a death sentence. Florida is one of only 2 states where a split recommendation like this can still lead to execution. Hold on to that number, 7 to 5, because it will matter again later in this story. The judge ultimately reached a striking, divided decision. For the murder of Martha Artzner, the death penalty. For the murder of Raymond Artzner, life imprisonment. That in itself is telling. Both victims died the same night, at the hands of the same man during the same events, and yet the ultimate sentence differed by victim. That says something about how carefully the court looked at the specific circumstances of each individual murder, rather than simply setting one total sentence for the whole of that night. Where the murder of Raymond could still be seen as arising from a direct confrontation. Outside, when he came out with a broomstick, the murder of Martha, who was shot 4 times at close range, unarmed and without any provocation after he had broken through a closed door, was, in the eyes of the court, of a different order. To arrive at that death sentence, the judge had to weigh aggravating circumstances against mitigating circumstances, as in every Florida death penalty case. Aggravating circumstances increase the severity of the crime. Mitigating circumstances might justify some understanding or leniency. The judge found 3 aggravating circumstances. First, that prior conviction for a violent felony, the resisting arrest with violence. Second, The murder was committed during a burglary, since Occhicone broke through a locked door to reach Martha. Third, the murder was committed in a cold, calculated, and premeditated manner, without any provocation from the victim. And then the other side of the scale. As a statutory mitigating circumstance, the judge found Occhicone was under the influence of extreme mental and emotional disturbance at the time of the murders, caused by a combination of severe alcohol addiction and depression. As a non-statutory mitigating circumstance, it was also weighed that Occhicone, once incarcerated, had behaved as a good prisoner and had adapted to prison life. That last one is an interesting detail. It's one of the few moments in these kinds of records where behavior after the crime, rather than before it, is explicitly weighed in the defendant's favor. And it underscores immediately how limited the room for leniency in these cases is. Even with these two mitigating factors, the judge concluded that the death penalty for the murder of Martha Artzner was the right outcome. And yet, even with two mitigating circumstances on the record, the outcome was the death penalty. That says something about how heavily aggravating circumstances can weigh against whatever mitigation is offered in return. And it's precisely that balance that would be challenged again and again in the years of appeals that followed. Occhicone appealed to the Florida Supreme Court. He argued, among other things, that the court had wrongly found the murder to be cold, calculated, and premeditated, that the jury had not been correctly instructed on the legal definition of burglary, and that the prosecutor's opening statement had unfairly prejudiced him. The Florida Supreme Court rejected these arguments and, in 1990, affirmed both the conviction and the death sentence. Shortly after, in 1991, his conviction became final when the U.S. Supreme Court declined to take up the case. But one of the justices of the Florida Supreme Court disagreed with the outcome, and it's worth naming that voice separately. Justice Kogan wrote a separate opinion in which he agreed with the conviction itself, but held that the death penalty, given the established extreme mental and emotional disturbance, was not proportionate to this crime. He pointed out that the judge himself had found Occhicone to be a heavy drinker and an alcoholic struggling with depression, and that this combination had produced an extreme mental and emotional disturbance. For Kogan, that did not fit a death sentence. His opinion, however, remained a minority view. And with that, at first glance, the case seemed settled in the early 90s. A confessed perpetrator, a double murder, a conviction affirmed by the highest court of the state. Nothing could be further from the truth. What followed was a legal battle that would stretch across more than 3 decades. A battle over a cellmate who may have testified against Occhicone in exchange for a lighter sentence, and who lied about it under oath. A battle over whether his original attorneys had done everything they could have done. A battle over that same kind of non-unanimous jury recommendation that decades later, courts would be forced to revisit. And ultimately, in the summer of 2026, a race against the clock in which not only the courtroom plays a role, but also the body of an 80-year-old man that after nearly 40 years on death row is slowly giving out. Coming this Thursday, the decades-long appeals in the Dominick Occhicone case, the role of a cellmate whose testimony may have been bought with a reduced sentence, what happened after the ruling in Hurst versus Florida, the role of his Catholic faith, and the tense days we find ourselves in right now, with an execution date closing in fast for a man who, if it happens, would become the oldest person Florida has ever executed, and only the second person over 80 put to death in the modern history of the United States.